They began to weigh the pepper as Holo looked on, leaning against a wall a short distance away, iron cup clasped between her hands. The weigh was a simple enough task, with a set weight being prepared on one side of the scales, and the other being loaded with pepper until it balanced. It was simple, but if one grew tired of seeing the counterweight sink, and was tempted to call it good enough and proceed to the next load, a merchant could unwittingly sustain a significant loss. So both the master and Lawrence carefully balanced each load until each was satisfied before proceeding to the next. For all its simplicity, the weighing was sensitive work, and it took 45 loads to finish. Pepper varied depending on its origin, but a load of Lawrence's product balanced roughly with a single counterweight should have been worth about 1 gold lumion piece. Based on his most current knowledge of exchange rates, 1 lumion equaled 34 2/3 trenny, the silver coin commonly used in the port town of Pasio. 45 loads at that rate would come to 1,560 trenny. Lawrence had bought the pepper for 1,000 trenny, so that meant a profit of 560 pieces. The spice trade was indeed delicious. Of course, gold and jewels, the raw materials for luxury goods, could fetch 2 or 3 times their initial purchase price, so this was a meager gain in comparison, but for a traveling merchant who spent his days crossing the plains, it was profit enough. Some merchants would haul the lowest quality oats on their very backs, destroying themselves as they crossed mountains, only to turn a 10% profit when they sold in the town. Indeed, compared with that, clearing more than 500 silver pieces by moving a single light bag of pepper was almost too savory to believe. Lawrence grinned as he packed the pepper back into its leather sack. Right, that's 45 measures' worth then. Where does this pepper come from? It was imported from Ramapata, in the kingdom of Lidon. Here's the certificate of import from the Malone Company. From Ramapata, then? It's come quite a ways, then. I can scarcely imagine the place, mused the master, narrowing his eyes and smiling as he took the certificate parchment Lawrence offered him. Town merchants often spent their entire lives in the villages of their birth. There were some who would go on pilgrimages after their retirement, but there was no time for such things when they were actively working. However, even Lawrence, the traveling merchant, knew little of the kingdoms of Lidon, save that it was famous for its spices. To get there from Pasio, one had to take the river all the way to the coast, and then board a long-distance sailing ship south across 2 separate seas, a journey of roughly 2 months. The language was different, of course, and apparently it was hot like summertime year-round in Lidon, and the population was permanently tanned near black from the time they were born. It seemed unbelievable, but there was spice, gold, silver, and iron that supposedly came from the place, and the Malone Company vouched for the origin of the pepper, which the certificate claimed was from Ramapata. Was it a real country? The certificate seems authentic, said the master. The kinds of bills of exchange, trusted promissory notes, and contracts that passed through town merchants were huge. Supposedly they could even recognize bills signed by small companies in faraway lands, to say nothing of huge organizations that had their main branches in a foreign country. Recognizing the seal of a company as large as Malone would be but the work of a moment. Signatures were important, but the soul of a contract was the seal. Right then, it'll be 1 lumion per measure. Will this do? Can you tell me what the lumion is trading at currently? Lawrence asked suddenly, even though he had some grasp of the coin's market value. Gold coin was generally used as an accounting currency. That is to say, it was the basis for calculating the values of the many other currencies in the world. Calculations were performed in gold currency, and then remitted in other, more convenient forms. Of course, in that situation, the market value of the currency in question became an issue. Lawrence was suddenly very nervous. Mr. Lawrence, as I recall, you follow the path of St. Metrogius in business, like your teacher did, correct? Yes, perhaps it's the protection of St. Metrogius that kept my travels safe and my business sound. So I presume that you'll take payment in trenny silver? Many traveling merchants wanted to repeat the successes of the past, and so rather than move randomly from one town to another, they trod the paths of the saints of old. Thus it was that the currency they used at a given time was quite predictable. For the master of the Laperon Trading Company to come to that conclusion so quickly meant he was a very shrewd merchant indeed. In trenny silver, he continued, the current rate is 32 5/6. The rate was lower than Lawrence remembered, but given this town's importance as a trade center, it was within the realm he could allow. In places where currencies from many different places all converged, the exchange rate with respect to accounting currencies tended to be lower. Lawrence did the calculations in his head at lightning speed. At this rate, he'd get 1,477 tranny for his pepper. The amount was less than he'd anticipated, but a tolerable price nonetheless. It would be a huge step toward realizing the dream of opening his own shop. He took a deep breath and extended his right hand toward the master. "That price will be fine, sir." The master's face broke into a smile, and he accepted Lawrence's hand. A merchant's spirits were never better than at the moment of a successful contract. This was one such moment. Holo cut in with a listless voice. "Whatever is the matter?" asked the master worriedly as he and Lawrence looked at Holo, who leaned unsteadily against the wall. In that instant, Lawrence remembered the sale of his furs to the Malone Company and grew suddenly nervous. The master of the La Perron Company was a canny merchant who managed his shop alone. Trying to outwit him was likely to end badly. Having Holo around didn't mean they had to try to trick their trading partners every single time. Even as Lawrence thought this, he stopped short. Holo was acting strangely. I'm dizzy." Holo held on to the cup as her unsteadiness grew worse, and the water seemed like it would spill out at any moment. The master walked up to her, looking worried as he stilled the cup and supported her slim shoulders. "Are you recovered?" "A bit, thank you," said Holo weakly, finally standing straight again with the master's help. She looked every bit the fasting nun suffering from a bout of anemia. Even someone who wasn't as devout as the master would have wanted to help her, but Lawrence noticed something strange. Underneath Holo's hood, her wolf ears had not drooped very much. "A long journey will tire even the strongest man," declared the master. Holo nodded slightly, then spoke. "I may well be tired from the travel. My vision seems to tilt suddenly." "That won't do. Ah, I have it. Shall I bring some goat milk? It's fresh from yesterday's milking," he said, offering her a chair and briskly going to fetch the milk without waiting for her response. Lawrence was surely the only one who had any premonition that Holo was going to do something else when she did not sit in the offered chair, and instead went to set the iron cup on the table. "Sir," she said to the master, whose back was turned, "I believe I am yet a bit dizzy." "Heavens, shall I call a physician?" asked the master, looking over his shoulder with heartfelt concern. Underneath the hood, Holo's expression was anything but the weak dizziness she feigned. "Look here, it's tilting before my very eyes," said Holo, taking the cup and spilling a few drops on the surface of the table, whereupon it flowed smoothly to Holo's right and off the edge of the table, dripping to the floor with a small plip sound. "Wha!" Lawrence walked swiftly to the table and put his hand on the scales. It was the same set of scales he'd so carefully gauged the accuracy of earlier. If they were even slightly off, it would mean a large loss for him, and so he'd checked the scales' accuracy carefully, but they aligned perfectly with the direction in which the water had flowed off the table. This led to a single conclusion. The weighing was over, and the plates of the scale were empty save for the counterweights on them. Lawrence took the set of scales and rotated it to face precisely the opposite direction. The scales tipped this way and that, owing to the sudden movement, but when set back on the table, their movement slowed and eventually stopped. According to the gradations, the scales balanced perfectly, despite the incline of the table. If they had been accurate, the reading would have been skewed by the slant of the table. The scales had clearly been tampered with. "So then, did I drink water, or was it wine?" inquired Holo. She looked back to the master, as did Lawrence. The master's expression froze, and sweat appeared on his forehead. "What I drank was wine, was it not?" Holo's voice sounded so amused that even her smile was practically audible. The master's face paled to a near deathly pallor. If the fact that he used fraudulent scales to swindle merchants was made public in a God-fearing town like this, all his assets would be forfeit, and he would face instant bankruptcy. "There's a saying that no one drinks less than the master of a full tavern. This must be what that means," said Lawrence. The stricken master was like a cornered hare, unable to cry out even as a predator's fangs pierced its skin. Lawrence walked back toward the master with an easy smile. "The secret to prosperity is being the only sober one, eh?" So much sweat beaded up on the master's forehead that you could trace a picture in it. "It seems I'm drunk on the same wine as my companion. I doubt we'll be able to remember anything we've seen or heard in here. Though in exchange, I may be a bit unreasonable." "What do you—" The master's face shivered in fear. Taking easy revenge here would be failing as a merchant, though. There wasn't even a motive anger at being deceived in Lawrence's mind. All he thought of were cold calculations of how much more profit he could extract from his opponent's fear. This was an unexpected opportunity. Lawrence drew near the man, his expression still smiling, his tone still every bit of the negotiating merchant. "Let's see. I think the amount we agreed to, plus the amount you were going to gain, plus... Oh, You'll let us buy double on a margin. Lawrence was demanding to be allowed to buy more than he had the cash to secure. It's self-evident that the more money a merchant can invest, the greater profit he can realize. If he can buy 2 silver pieces worth of goods with a single piece, he will double his profit, pure and simple. But to buy 2 pieces worth with 1 piece, he would obviously need collateral. Since the merchant is essentially borrowing money, the lender has the right to demand collateral from the borrower. However, the master was in no position to make such a demand, which is why Lawrence pushed such an unreasonable position. It's a third-rate merchant that doesn't take advantage of weakness. I can't possibly. You can't do it? Oh, that's a shame. I'm feeling significantly less drunk. The master's face was so wet it seemed to nearly melt as the sweat mixed with tears. His face a mask of despair, he slumped, defeated. As for the goods, let's see. Given the amount, perhaps some high-quality arms? Surely you have lots of goods bound for Reuvenhagen. Arms, you say? The master looked up, seeming to see a glimmer of hope. He had probably been assuming that Lawrence never planned to pay him back. They're always a good bet for turning a tidy profit, and I can get the loan back to you quickly that way. What say you? Reuvenhagen served as a resupply base for the efforts to subjugate the pagans. Any items that served in the fighting flew off the shelves year-round. It was difficult to sustain depreciation losses when selling such goods. Since Lawrence would be able to purchase double the normal amount on margin, he'd have double the insurance against depreciation, which made weapons a good choice for a margin buy. The master's face shifted to that of a shrewdly calculating merchant. Weapons, you say? Since I'm sure there's a trading company in Reuvenhagen with connections to yours, selling them here will balance out the books. In short, after Lawrence sold the weapons he bought with money borrowed from the Laperdon company to another company in Reuvenhagen, he wouldn't have to come all the way back to Porisson to return the money. In certain situations, the give and take of money could be accomplished with nothing more than entries in a ledger. It was the great triumph of the merchant class. What say you? At times, the business smile of a merchant could be an intimidating thing. Even among such smiles, Lawrence's was exceptionally intimidating, as he cornered the manager of the Laperdon Trading Company, who, unable to refuse, finally nodded. My thanks. I'd like to arrange for the goods immediately, as I hope to depart for Reuvenhagen very soon. Understood. As for the valuation, I shall leave that to you. After all, I trust in God. The master's lip twisted bitterly in what must have been a pained smile. It was unavoidable that he had praised the weapons rather cheaply. Are you two quite finished? Said Holo, guessing that the strong-armed negotiation was over. The master gave a sigh of dismay. It seemed there was still one person who wanted to say. I dare say my drunkenness is lifting as well, said Holo, her head tilted charmingly to one side, but she must have seemed like a devil to the master. Some fine wine and mutton would do much for my spirits. Make sure the mutton's from the flanks now. The master could only nod his head at her casual imperiousness. Make it quick now, said Holo, partially in jest, but hearing these words from the girl who adroitly saw through his doctored scales, the master turned around and scampered from the room like a pig smacked on the rear. One couldn't help but feel the master was overdoing it a bit, but if his fraud was made public he would be ruined. To that extent, a little bowing and scraping was a small price to pay. Lawrence would have taken a huge hit to his own assets if the trick hadn't been noticed. Poor little man, said Holo, with a delighted chuckle that made her seem even nastier. You've certainly a keen eye, as usual. I didn't notice a thing. I'm beautiful and my tail fur is sleek, but my eyes and ears are also keen. I noticed the moment we entered the room. I suppose he would have been sly enough to fool the likes of you, though, said Holo, sighing, waving her hand dismissively. Lawrence would have been happier if she'd said something sooner, but the reality was he had not noticed the fraud, and the fact that Holo did had turned a great loss into a great gain. It wouldn't kill him to be polite. I have nothing to say for myself, Lawrence admitted. Holo's eyes twinkled at his unexpected meekness. Oh-ho! I see you've matured a bit. Lawrence, indeed having nothing to say for himself, could only smile, chagrined. There is something known as spring fever. It is most common during the winter in places far from rivers or seas. The streams freeze, and people survive on salted meat and stale bread day in and day out. It's not that no vegetables can survive the frost, but rather that such produce is better sold than eaten. Eating the produce does nothing for the chill, but with the money gained from its sale, firewood can be bought and furnaces stoked. Eating naught but meat and drinking nothing but wine takes its toll, and by spring many have broken out in rashes. This is spring fever, and it is proof of neglect for one's health. Naturally, it is well known that resisting the temptation of meat and the comfort of wine will spare one such this fate. Eat vegetables and meat only in moderation. Such will the Church's sermon be every Sunday. Thus, come spring, the sufferers of spring fever will often find themselves being terribly scolded by the priest. Gluttony is, after all, one of the 7 deadly sins, whether or not the glutton knows it. Lawrence heaved a long-suffering sigh at Holo's overindulgence. She burped. Whew, that was tasty. She was in high spirits after washing down the fine mutton with some fine wine. Not only was it all free of charge, but after eating and drinking her fill, she could curl up in the wagon bed for a nap. Even the most extravagant merchant will, as a matter of course, think ahead and limit his excesses, but not Holo. Tapping her feet in delight, she had eaten and drunk with glee and only stopped to take a break. Lawrence reckoned that if it had been their travel provisions, she would have eaten 3 weeks' worth, and she drank so much wine he began to wonder where it was going. If she had turned around and sold the food she extorted from the Laperon master, she would have put a big dent in her own debt to Lawrence. This was yet another reason Lawrence was stunned. Now then, I dare say I'll take a nap, said Holo. Lawrence didn't even bother to look at the source of this exemplar of depravity. In addition to squeezing some fine wine and mutton from the Laperon company master, Lawrence had obtained a large load of arms at a very reasonable price. He and his companion left the town of Porosan without so much as waiting for the noontime bells. Little time had passed since then, and the sun was just now overhead. With the clear skies and warm sunshine, it was perfect weather for a midday drink, followed by a nap. Owing to the load, the wagon bed was in a state of disarray, but with wine enough in her, Holo probably wouldn't mind. The trade road that they took to Reuvenhagen was full of steep inclines and sudden turns just outside of Porosan, but smoothed out and gave a grand view as it slowly descended. The road meandered on. It was well traveled, which made for a firmly packed surface with holes being quickly filled. Even though her bed was packed full of sword hilts, Holo was easily able to nap on top of them and pass the afternoon away since the road was so smooth. Then there was Lawrence, who had drunk no wine and spent the day looking at a horse's backside, reins in hand. His jealousy made it easy for him not to look at Holo. I ought to tend to my tail, said Holo. Her tail the only thing she was diligent about. She pulled it out of her robes without a hint of concern. Not that any was warranted. The expansive view meant there was no danger of being surprised by an approaching traveler. Holo began to comb her tail, occasionally picking a flea out or pausing to lick the fur clean. The care she took with her tail was visible in her silent, single-minded attention to the job. She worked from the very base of the tail, which was covered in dark brown fur, finally reaching its fluffy white tip, and then suddenly looked up. Oh, that's right. What? When we get to the next town, I want oil. Oil? I've heard it would be good to use on my tail. Lawrence turned away from Holo wordlessly. So will you buy some for me? Asked Holo with a charming smile, her head tilted. Even a poor man would be hard-pressed to resist that smile, but Lawrence only glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. Figures larger than her smile danced before his eyes, specifically the debt she owed him. The clothes you're wearing now, plus the extras, the comb, the travel fee, the wine and food, have you added them all up? There's the head tax when we enter a town as well. Surely you're not telling me you can't do sums, said Lawrence, mimicking Holo's tone, but Holo still smiled. I can surely do sums, but I'm still better at subtraction, she proclaimed, then laughed at some private amusement. Lawrence knew she was hiding some kind of comeback, but her manner was strange. Perhaps she was still drunk. He glanced at the wineskins that lay in the wagon bed. They had taken the Laperon master for 5 skins of wine, 2 of which were now empty. It wasn't impossible that she was drunk. Well, perhaps you should try adding up all you've used. If you're such a wise wolf, you should be able to work out my answer from that. All right, I shall, said Holo with a smile and a cheerful nod. Just as Lawrence looked forward again, thinking how nice it would be if she were always so agreeable, Holo continued. You will definitely buy me some, she said. Lawrence cast his eyes askance to spy her grinning at him. Maybe she really was drunk. It was a very charming smile. Just look what happens to the wits of the proud wise wolf when she has too much wine, muttered Lawrence to himself. Holo's head fought from one shoulder to the other. If she fell drunkenly out of the wagon, she could be injured. Lawrence reached out to steady her slim shoulder, and Holo grabbed his hand with a quickness that was nothing short of wolf-like. Surprised, Lawrence looked into her eyes. She was neither drunk nor laughing. "After all, it's thanks to me that your wagon bed was so cheaply filled. You'll pull in a tidy profit." Her charm had vanished. "On what basis? I won't have you belittle me. Surely you don't think I missed you strong-arming that master? I've a sharp mind, keen eyes, aye, but don't forget, my ears are good too. I couldn't have missed your negotiations." Holo grinned unpleasantly, showing her fangs. "So you'll buy some oil for me, yes?" In fact, Lawrence had taken advantage of the master's weakness during his negotiations, and it was also true that things had gone just as Lawrence had hoped. He cursed himself for being so obviously pleased upon signing the contract. Once it was known that someone was going to make a lot of money, they were obvious targets for sponging and wheedling. It was human nature. Well, how much do you think you're in debt to me for?" "It's 140 silver. Have you any idea how much money that is? And now you think I'm going to spend more on you?" "Oh? What, you want me to pay you back?" Holo looked at Lawrence with an expression of mild surprise, as if to say she could pay him back at any time she chose. There are none in this world who don't wish to be paid back money they have lent. Lawrence gritted his teeth and glared at Holo, enunciating his response very carefully. "Of course I do." If Holo paid back what she owed in a lump sum, he'd be able to fill his wagon bed with more and better goods, which would mean improved profits. More investment equaled greater return. It was at the very center of a merchant's world. Yet Holo's expression changed completely at Lawrence's words. She regarded him coldly, as if to say, "Oh, that's how it is." Lawrence faltered at the completely unexpected change. "So that's how you've been thinking," said Holo. "What do you—" Lawrence would have finished with mean, but Holo's rapid-fire response cut him off. "Well, I suppose if I pay my debts, that makes me a free wolf. I see. I'll just pay you back, then." Hearing these words, Lawrence understood what Holo wanted to say. Some days earlier, during a disturbance in Pazio, Lawrence had seen Holo's wolf form and retreated in fear. Deeply hurt, Holo tried to leave Lawrence, but Lawrence stopped her by saying he would follow her all the way to the North Country to collect the money she owed him for destroying his clothes. "Come what may, you'll pay me back," he had said, "so leaving me now won't get you anything." Holo stayed with Lawrence based on the reasoning that making him come all the way out to the North Country would be a bother, and Lawrence had thought that the business about debt repayment was just a pretense for both of them. No, he'd believed it. He believed that even if she were to repay the debt, she would still wish for him to travel with her to the forests of the North Country, though her bashfulness would prevent her from admitting it, and Holo had now turned the tables on him. She used the fact that the debt was his own pretense against him. A single word jumped into his mind. Unfair. Holo was truly unfair. "In that case, I'll just give your money back and hie myself north, shall I? I wonder how Paro and Miuri are faring." Holo looked away, purposefully letting a small sigh escape. Lawrence, at a loss for words, glared sourly at the wolf girl that sat beside him and wondered how to retort. He imagined that if he was stubborn and demanded that she pay him now or go on her merry way, Holo would really do it. And that wasn't what Lawrence wanted. This was where he'd have to cry uncle. There really wasn't anything charming about Holo. Lawrence stared at her, furiously trying to think of a comeback, but Holo looked away from him obstinately. Some time passed. "We didn't decide the due date for repayment. Just as long as I get it by the time we arrive in the North Country. Will that do?" Some part of Lawrence was still stubborn. He simply couldn't let the cheeky wolf girl have everything she wanted. This was as far as he could give in. Holo seemed to understand that. She slowly turned toward him and smiled, satisfied. "I should think I'll be able to repay you by the time we've arrived in the North Country," she said purposefully, drawing near him. "And it's my intention to pay you back with interest, which means the more I borrow, the greater profit for you. So you'll do it for me, yes?" Holo's eyes met Lawrence's as she looked up at him. They were beautiful eyes with red-brown irises. "The oil, you mean?" "Yes. Make it part of my debt, but please, buy it for me, won't you?" The plea was strangely rational, and Lawrence couldn't think of a good rejoinder. All he could do was slump his head sideways as if exhausted. "My thanks," said Holo, brushing against Lawrence's arm like a cat asking for affection, which wasn't a bad feeling at all. He knew that was what Holo wanted, and it was an unavoidable part of his long, lonely time as a traveling merchant. "Still, you really did haggle him down, didn't you?" asked Holo, attending once more to her tale as she reclined against Lawrence. This particular wolf could sense lies, so Lawrence didn't bother lying and answered truthfully. Rather, he put himself in the position of having no choice but to be haggled down. Yet the interest rate on the arms was not good. The most profitable method would be to import the materials and then assemble and sell the weapons. As far as the business of selling completed weapons went, simply by going somewhere with a constant demand for large amounts of weaponry and turning a fair profit, the amount by which the goods could be bargained down was limited. Lawrence headed to Reuvenhagen for that very same fair profit. How much? What's the point of asking that? Holdo glanced up at Lawrence from her position leaning against him and then looked quickly away, at which point Lawrence more or less understood. Despite her forcing of the oil issue, she was actually quite concerned about his profits. What? I was just worried about sponging off a traveling merchant who was barely scraping by. That is all. Lawrence tapped Holdo's head lightly at the nasty comment. Weapons are the best-selling product in Reuvenhagen, but many merchants bring them into the city. Thus, the interest rate on them drops, and the amount I could bargain him down is limited. But you bought so much, you'll yet come out ahead, yes? The wagon bed was not full, strictly speaking, but it was well laden. The goods were solid, and though the interest was low, in comparison to Lawrence's initial investment, the actual amount of material was nice indeed. The fact that he was getting double the material for his investment was icing on the cake. Like the saying goes, one raindrop raises the sea, and so Lawrence's gain might be second only to his profit from the pepper. In truth, the proceeds would be enough to buy more apples than would fit in the wagon bed, to say nothing of oil. But if Lawrence told Holdo that there was no telling what demands she might make, so he held his tongue. Holdo, blissfully ignorant, simply groomed her tail. Looking at her, Lawrence couldn't help but feel a bit guilty. Well, I should think we'll make enough to pay for some oil anyway, he said. Holdo nodded, apparently satisfied. Still, now that I think about it, some spice would be quite tasty, Lawrence murmured, as he estimated the likely gain against the cost of the weapons. You've eaten it? I'm not like you glutton. I'm talking about the profit. Humph. Well, why don't you load up on spice again, then? The prices in Reuvenhagen and Porosson aren't so very different. I'd take a loss after buying the tariff. Then give it up, I say, said Holdo shortly, nibbling the tip of her tail. If I could get a rate about like what I'd normally get for spices or maybe a little more, I'd make enough to open a shop. Saving enough money to open his own shop was Lawrence's dream. Though he'd made a sizable amount in the kerfuffle in Pazio, the goal remained distant. Surely there's something, said Holdo. Say, jewels or gold? Those are sure things, no? Reuvenhagen is not a profitable place for such things, really. Perhaps catching a bit of fluff in her nose, Holdo gave a small sneeze as she licked her fur. Why is that? She asked. The tariff is too high. It's protectionism. They levy serious taxes on all but a certain group of merchants. There's no business to be had there. Towns that weakened the foundation of commerce with this kind of protectionism were not uncommon, but Reuvenhagen's policy was aimed at turning monopolistic profits. Gold brought to the church in Reuvenhagen could be stamped with the church's holy seal, and such gold would bring safe travels, happiness in the future, or triumph in battle, all by the grace of God. There was even gold for guaranteeing happiness in the afterlife, and it all sold for exorbitant prices. The church council that controlled Reuvenhagen colluded with the merchants under their power to preserve the monopoly, so taxes on gold entering the city were terrifying and punishments for smuggling harsh. Huh. If we somehow smuggled gold in, we'd be able to sell it for, 10 times what we paid. But the danger rises with the profit, so I've no choice but to make money bit by bit. Lawrence shrugged, thinking wistfully on the end of his road. In a city like Reuvenhagen, there were plenty of merchants who made in a single day what Lawrence had spent his entire life striving for. It seemed unfair. No, worse than unfair. It was downright strange. Oh, truly? Came Holdo's unexpected reply. Do you have some idea otherwise? This was Holdo the Wise Wolf, after all. She might have come up with some unheard-of scheme. Lawrence turned to her unexpectedly. Pausing in her grooming for a moment, Holdo looked up at him. Why don't you just sneak it in? If she was always this foolish, it would be charming, thought Lawrence to himself upon hearing her suggestion. If that were possible, everyone would do it. Oh, so you can't do that. When tariffs go up, smuggling does too. It's a basic principle. Their inspections are very thorough. Surely a small amount wouldn't be found. If they do find anything, they'll cut off your hand at the very least. It's not worth the risk. It would be worth it if you were bringing a larger amount in, but that's impossible. Holdo smoothed her tail fur and nodded, satisfied with her grooming. Lawrence couldn't see much difference, but apparently Holdo had her standards. 'Tis true, she said. Well, your business is steady enough. It is well, as long as you make steady coin. Right you are, but I seem to have a certain companion bent on wasting that same steady coin. Holo yawned, pretending not to hear the jibe as she squirmed to hide her tail. She rubbed her eyes and crept back to her place in the wagon bed. Lawrence had not been terribly serious. He stopped following Holo's movements and looked at the road ahead. Trying to talk to her once she decided to sleep was an exercise in futility, so he abandoned the prospect. For a while he could hear the clattering of weapons as she pushed them aside to make a place to nap, but soon silence returned, and he heard her sigh contentedly. Lawrence glanced back and saw her curled into a ball, just like a dog or cat. He couldn't help smiling. He couldn't very well say what he thought for many reasons, but he did want her to stay with him. As Lawrence pondered this, Holo suddenly spoke. I forgot to say it earlier, but the wine we got from the master. I've no intention of drinking it all myself. This evening we must drink together. And enjoy that mutton, too. Mildly surprised, Lawrence turned to look at her, but she was already curled back up. But this time she was smiling. Lawrence looked ahead, holding the reins, and drove the horse carefully, so as not to shake the wagon any more than he had to.